Hi, I'm Ted Pattison from Critical Path Training. In this video session, we're going to look at managing data with SharePoint 2010 and some of the new support we have for creating forms to support our lists. Now, when we look back to the SharePoint 2007 product lifecycle, we have customers and developers in particular who basically said, well, I like the fact that I have a new form and an edit form, but there's some scenarios where I want more than one edit form or more than one new form. Maybe there's a common scenario where I just need a set of controls, but there's some edge scenarios where my users need a more advanced set of controls, and I don't want a one-size-fits-all where I have to give the users doing the simpler editing scenario a more complicated page than has to be there. We also might want to move away from simple.ispx and try to utilize InfoPath, because we don't need developers. We can have power users who create very sophisticated forms with all kinds of drop-down controls and rich validation that can be created in a declarative fashion. Okay, and also we might want to be able to make changes to the web parts inside of our forms. So with SharePoint 2010, here are the enhancements we have to the support for forms behind lists. First, we have multiple forms per type, meaning that you can have multiple edit forms or multiple new forms or multiple view forms. We also have user actions, so that if you have a second edit form, we provide the user a way to edit, to move to that. Also, we have new Web 2.0 user influence, so that we have a lot more JavaScript and a lot more interaction with the user without having to do postbacks. Okay, we can also replace the default view and edit a web part, kind of like what we did with the data view web part in the SharePoint Designer in 2007. However, now we have something called the XSLT web part, in which I can go in and edit with the SharePoint Designer, but I don't preempt my ability to go in and further customize it with the browser, because there's just now one web part that we use that has XSLT behind it that can be understood by the browser as well as the SharePoint Designer. And also, we have some InfoPath integration. Now, as far as multiple form support, as I mentioned, we can have any number of forms for display, any number of forms for new, any number of forms for edit. But just being able to have a second or a third is going to be a very important thing to be able to do for a lot of different scenarios. Now, there will also be a default form for each one of these modes. There will be a default display, a default new, and a default edit form. And the other forms will be secondary forms, meaning that we're going to have to provide some kind of navigation element so someone can get to these forms. Now, in this slide, we see a hierarchy of different classes which represent our web parts. Now, on the second row here, there are two web parts called the list form web part and the list view web part. And these are the things we've had since SharePoint 2003. The list view web part is what allows us to take a list or document library and show all the items on a web part that we put possibly on the home page of our site. The list form web part was something that we would use on typically the edit or the view form for a particular list item. Now, the problem that we had is that the list form web part and the list view web part worked with CAML behind the scenes, not XSLT. Now, the SharePoint Designer introduced the ability to change a web part called the data view web part, or really the data view web part or data form web part. And what happened is you would have a web part that had XSLT behind it, and the SharePoint Designer gave you the ability to change the formatting with a WYSIWYG environment, and behind the scenes they were basically creating an XSLT transform as you dragged and dropped the fields from your list onto the data web part designer. So now what we have is we've moved to a new web part, which is called the XSLT list form web part and the XSLT list view web part. And what's nice about them is they don't have CAML behind them. Instead, they have XSLT. And so just like using the data view web part, inside the SharePoint Designer, you can move things around. But unlike what we had in 2007, which is I would have a list view web part and I'd transform it with the SharePoint Designer to be a data view web part, then I couldn't go back and edit it through the browser. Now, both the browser and the SharePoint Designer are able to work with the XSLT list view web part. Okay, now just to put this matrix up, the list view web part and list form web parts, those are older technologies, the list view based on CAML. And so what we prefer now is to use the XSLT list view web part, because that's basically based on XSLT. And if you look down at all these different checkboxes, you can see where the XSLT view web part, has advantages over some of these older web parts. We'll also see that the XSLT view web part is going to perform better than the data view web part that you might have used in SharePoint 2007. So the way things work is that the XSLT list view web part is able to get a CAML query, which gives it the XML data, and that's kind of what we refer to as the SP data source. Now, from that, it loads in XSLT that we can just use the XSLT that comes by default, or we can customize it with the SharePoint Designer. But then it takes the XSLT, compiles it, and uses that to perform a transform to render the HTML output. Okay, now in addition to the XSLT web part, we also have some neat integration with InfoPath2010. And that is, inside the SharePoint Designer, if you open a list, you're going to see the ability to create secondary forms using InfoPath. And if you have a scenario where you have a couple different text boxes inside of a standard edit form, well, maybe you want to put some extra validation in place. And by sticking with .ISPX forms, you'd probably have to move to a development effort to really put some type of logic in place. So when someone typed inside the text box, we ensured through a regular expression it was a social security number or formatted like a US phone number. But now, if I can create the form with InfoPath, I can just take a text box and go to validation properties and easily change that to basically give me the validation I want, as a power user, as opposed to, having to call in the developer to do that type of work. Now, here's an example of what the InfoPath form is going to look like if I just took one and created one from the announcements list. And inside of InfoPath, we can simply go to our different controls and go to their properties and change them and add things like validation or various rules in place. And then there's a publish metaphor for me to take the InfoPath form and publish it back into the SharePoint site. Okay. Now, let's go ahead and look at a demo. In particular, we'll look at a demo of using the XSLT web part from inside of SharePoint. So here I am in a regular site. Now notice that I have a contacts list. On the home page here, I don't have any web parts yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to go and add a web part to the home page. I'll come down here, we will say edit page, and we just have a big blank area. And so inside of this wiki page, I'm going to say insert, and I'm going to choose web part, and I'm going to go to lists and libraries and find the contacts list, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to add that inside. So now that we've done that, notice that there is the ability to add a new item in place right here. Now, what I'm going to do with this home page is, first of all, let's go ahead and save my change. And now we'll go back to the home page and we can see the web part right there. Note that I can see things inside. Let's go ahead and open up the SharePoint Designer. And with the SharePoint Designer, let's go ahead and open this site. And then as we open this particular site, let's go ahead and find that home page right there. And we'll go ahead and open that up, and we'll go into the edit view of this particular page. And at this point, loading data, it loads the file inside here. So now note that I can see this particular page. I can see things that are inside. You can see behind it that it's working with an SLT transform. If I come down here, what we can see is inside of the page, we can see that the whole web part is based on the XSLT web part. And if I get down here far enough, XSLT list view web part. And so what I'm able to do is go and take things like this particular name and go and find various options, such as taking that and let's change that to a different color and save that back. And now that we've done that, we've made a change here to the XSLT transform. Now let's go ahead and go back to the list right here, and what we can see is, well, that turns red. Well, back in SharePoint 2007, you would have had to take a list view web part and transform it to a data view web part. Then you would be unable to edit this through the browser. But now, if I say edit web part right here, I still have the complete ability to come inside here and to basically still do all the types of editing that I want. And that's one of the big benefits of this particular web part. Okay, so in summary, we now have the XSLT list view web part and the XSLT form view web part, and they are basically meant to replace the web parts that pre-existed: the list view, the form view, and the data view and the data form web part.